discredit Wundt's structural psychology and his introspective method. The Gestalt psychologists who emerged around the same time as Titchener was writing his Law of Prior Entry didn't mind Wundt's focus on the content of consciousness, but they vehemently disputed his emphasis on the importance of raw sensations. In his Behaviorist Manifesto, Watson asserted that human psychology has failed to make good its claim as a natural science due to a mistaken notion that its fields of facts are conscious phenomena and that introspection is the only direct method of ascertaining these facts. It has enmeshed itself in a series of speculative questions which are not open to experimental treatment. It's interesting that Watson's behaviorist, we'll call it revolution, endorsed something like the atomistic assumption that Wundt adopted, but replaced sensations, ideas, and images by stimuli and responses, and also endorsed the notion of connectionism in the form of how stimuli get connected to responses, learning, which became the preoccupation of certainly North American psychology in the first half of the 20th century. In his book Behaviorism, that was released about a decade after this Psych Review article, he notes, behaviorism claims that consciousness is neither a definable nor a usable concept, that it is merely another word for the soul of a more ancient time. The old psychology is thus dominated by a kind of subtle religious philosophy. And he meant that as a negative. So Watson eschewed the concepts of ideas and images and their container consciousness, all of which were hypothetical and unobservable, and he replaced these atoms of Wundt's structuralist psychology with stimuli and responses. In mainstream psychology, particularly in North America, the failure of introspection to illuminate how the mind works, and the appeal of Watson's alternative emphasis on on observable behavior led to a dramatic decrease in the discussion of attention, consciousness, and mental processes in general. It took almost a half a century in North American psychology to overcome the intellectual shackles that behaviorism imposed on scientific psychology, and this eventual rejection is represented here in a portrait of Watson that is composed only of S's and R's. A reaction to behaviorism, particularly the radical form advanced by B.F. Skinner, was brewing in the post-World War II period. There were several contributing factors. Accidents during World War II, initially attributed to human failure, were recognized as due to limitations of human information processing that had not been anticipated in the design of the machines of war. The field of cybernetics was born, and a metric for measuring information and its transmission was developed. And Hebb's organization of behavior was published in 1949. And he laid the groundwork. I wouldn't say he himself launched it, but he laid the groundwork for what some people refer to as the cognitive revolution. Somewhat later, B.F. Skinner's attempt to understand verbal behavior in Watsonian terms was demolished by Noam Chomsky. All of these forces created an atmosphere in which psychologists who were scientists felt that it was not only possible but important to worry about the mental constructs like attention. Hebb's book was and continues to be very influential. In his preface, he says, "In this book, I have tried to bring together a number of different lines of research and a general theory of behavior that attempts to bridge the gap between neurophysiology and psychology, as well as that between laboratory psychology and the problems of the clinic." Some scholars have asserted that Hebb's ideas will have a role in psychology that is akin to that which Darwin's ideas have in biology. Regardless, whether one accepts that attribution, one of Hebb's themes was that we should try to explain the organization and disorganization of behavior and thought in terms of the biological organ, the brain, that's responsible for them. What we now call the Hebb synapse, or Hebb rule, and his cell assembly theory represent a very important effort in that direction. I'm going to cover a little bit of my autobiography in the next lecture, but I'll just mention I graduated as an undergraduate and started my graduate program in 1969. So I guess that's been almost 5 decades. As a young soldier in the information processing or cognitive revolution, I'm inclined to emphasize how Watson's and Skinner's S's and R's were replaced by concepts such as stages of processing, information transmission, mental representation, selective attention, limited processing capacity, alertness, etc. This simple diagram of information transmission from the Bell Telephone Laboratories Technical Journal played an important role in the cognitive revolution. And this was not about people. This was literally about telephone wires. Leaders of the cognitive revolution, like George Miller, Donald Broadbent, and Fred Atniev, were taken with the idea of the organization of the organism as an information processing device that might be described as a receiver and transmitter of information, like the telephone wire. I guess metaphorically what this might mean.
All right, girls, now this is your last chance. If one piece of candy gets past you and into the packing room unwrapped, you're fired. Yes, ma'am.
This is from the 1950s TV show I Love Lucy.
Oh, this is easy. Yeah, we can handle this, okay?
Shortly after Hebb's book was published, a technological tool, the multi-track tape recorder, permitted early attention pioneers like Cherry, Broadbent, and Treisman to conduct selective attention experiments using auditory stimuli. They could deliver messages to both ears, or different messages from different locations in space, or to even to the two ears with headphones, as illustrated in this picture. The best known real-life example of the kind of situation that these early attention researchers were exploring is the cocktail party effect, many of you may have heard of or can imagine, which entails listening to a single conversation or voice in a crowded room full of many people talking at the same time. It is possible to do this because the voice you might be attending is a different voice from the other ones and might be focused upon because of its frequencies. Plus, it's coming from a different location in space than the other voices. In a few minutes, we'll illustrate some of the factors that make it easier to attend to one of several simultaneously presented messages than other factors. But a key methodological innovation in Cherry's studies was the use of dichotic shadowing. Two auditory streams were presented to the participant, one to each ear, and the subject's task was to repeat back what was presented on one ear, while ignoring what was presented to the other ear. In such dichotic shadowing experiments, subjects could report very little of the rejected stream. Some changes in physical properties they could notice. So a switch from English to German went unnoticed, as did a switch from English to a backward track of English that's played backwards. But changes in gender or pitch of the speaker were almost always noticed, as was the replacement of the voice in the unattended ear with a tone. And in subsequent memory tests, reinforcing a point I made earlier about attention being the gateway to memory, subjects didn't recognize words that had been repeated, presented in the rejected stream, any more than they recognized words that hadn't been presented at all. But they could recognize words that had been presented and repeated by them in the unattended stream. I can't easily illustrate dichotic listening because I don't have headphones for everybody, wherein the different messages are presented to different locations in space or to each ear. But we can illustrate how much easier it is to separate two messages from the same location when they're spoken by different voices as compared to when they're spoken in the same voice.
An intricate, headlong brook in its earlier course through those woods with dark secrets of pool and cascade. But by the time it reached Lynn's Hollow, it was a quiet, well-conducted...
I'm going to try this without the speaker because it's only doing this mono.
I reached Lynn's Hollow, it was a quiet, well-conducted little stream.
Another one.
The sun was coming in at the window, warm and bright. The orchid on the slope with the dark house was in a bridal flush, but by the time I reached Lynn's Hollow, it was a quiet, well-conducted little stream.
I hope that was hard.
The dog ran upstairs. The sun came out from behind the range door. The house realizing as the house city of rubble and ashes that only Silas was the one house left standing. He sniffed the air. At night, scratched the kitchen. The ruined city gave off a radioactive. Behind the door, the stove was making pancakes a mile, which filled the house with a rich and baked odor and the scent of maple syrup.
And I hope this one's easier.
The shore
35.
presents an unbroken
Lunch
array
tables
of
sprouted from patio walls. Playing cards fluttered onto pads in a shower of tips. Martinis manifested on an open bench with egg salad sandwiches.
balconies and a dozen flags flying from its roof.
So it would only be easier if you were trying to listen to one of them. Did anyone recognize the male voice? Leonard Nimoy? Mr. Spock? I think I don't need that. I'll need that. If I do, I'll Broadbent simplified the dichotic listening task and eliminated the possibility that participants could use transitional probabilities that, of course, would be present in prose to assist with selection, because that is one of the factors that can be used. In his paradigm, digits were presented simultaneously in pairs, one to each ear, in a rapid sequence of 3 pairs. I can only illustrate this visually. Imagine that happened auditorily. Subjects didn't report the digits in the order in which they were heard. Rather, they reported all the digits that were presented to one ear, and then all or some of the digits that were presented to the other ear. Studies like Cherry's and Broadbent's split span experiment led him to this mechanical model. He was a fan of simple models. Broadbent, by the way, was a scientist at the Applied Psychology Research Unit when he conducted these experiments, which then was located at the University of Cambridge. He used this model to both summarize and explain the results from these experiments. And you have to imagine that in this mechanical model, the words are like balls or marbles that are being thrown down the tubes at the top of this Y-shaped apparatus. In pairs, 3 successive pairs. If you imagine that, you'll probably recognize that unless the gate, the swinging gate at the junction between the 2 tubes is shifted in one direction or the other, there will be a jam up, kind of like the traffic jams we've experienced coming here on several days, and nothing will happen. So in Broadbent's model, the participant lets all of the balls or words presented to one tube or ear through by shifting the gate in one direction, and then when those have finished, the gate is shifted and the other balls or words are allowed to process through. If that was how the system worked, then the report, which is sort of represented by the tube at the bottom, the report would entail all the words or stimuli presented to one ear followed by all the stimuli presented to the other ear, rather than reporting the stimuli as they had been presented. A year later, in 1958, in Broadbent's first magnus opus, which was a book entitled Perception and Communication, 1958, he expanded this very simple filtering model with a more complete picture of human information processing. And I'll mention that in 1958, Broadbent was appointed as the director of the Applied Research Unit at Cambridge, and he served as its director for 16 years. In this model, information from the senses are recorded in, we'll call it a sensory-oriented short-term memory system, and a selective filter that's sort of like the little gate in his Y-shape to protect the limited capacity channel from getting too much information by selecting what to pass through for further processing. The information that's passed through can be used in our behavior. That's the rightward arrow that's pointing to a box he labeled system for varying output until some input is secured. That's a fairly complicated way of saying the motor system. But what he was trying to say here is that the whole purpose of the motor system is to achieve some goal. But it also might allow information to enter his store of conditional probabilities of past events. I think of that as long-term memory. And information from that system can be retrieved and put into the limited capacity system. So this is Broadbent's complicated model. Many aspects of this model have been modified, if not rejected, since 1958. Though it still stands as a kind of benchmark against which future models are usually compared. But in a 1993 chapter that Moray wrote in a book that was honoring Broadbent, and Moray was one of Broadbent's earliest students, Moray noted that from the perspective of everyday situations, and importantly, the perspective of applied cognitive psychology, people behave more or less as if this was a model of their information processing system, as if they had a central bottleneck, a channel with a limited capacity for processing information. As many of you know, in the United Kingdom, there's been a long-standing Cambridge-Oxford rivalry. So it's noteworthy that the first empirical attack on Broadbent's filter theory came from, as it turns out, two undergraduates at Oxford. Gray and Wedderburn simply repeated Broadbent's split-span experiment, but instead of using unrelated materials, they used materials that could be grouped based on psychological rather than physical year of arrival properties. In one experiment, they split the syllables of 2 3-syllable words so that on hearing the words, the participants would have to switch that gate, which, according to Broadbent, couldn't be switched so rapidly, between the two ears. And in fact, their participants had no trouble reporting the two words, even though they were moving across ears, and according to Broadbent's filter theory, couldn't be heard as words. Illustrated here is an example in which they used a different method to group the material across the two ears. In this case, there'll be 3 digits, but also essentially a short sentence. In this study, their participants had no trouble reporting what they heard according to the meaning rather than according to the ear of arrival or the physical channel along which the information had been presented. And Anne Treisman conducted many auditory experiments. Today she's most famous for her feature integration theory that we'll talk about later, but which is a visual modality, primarily a visual modality issue. But in the 60s, she was conducting experiments that were essentially follow-ups to Broadbent's ideas and also challenged them to a degree. And in Norman's chapter, he accommodates results from Gray and Wedderburn and Treisman's studies by moving the selection process to after inputs had made contact with their long-term memory representations. So here he has, as did Broadbent, the notion of a sensory system that feeds information into something you might think of as awareness. A very important input to this system is called pertinence. My favorite model from the Broadbent and post-Broadbent era is this model from Fred Atnian. It was only published a year after Broadbent published Perception and Communication. It was published in a classic paper called In Defense of Homunculi. I'm not going to go into the homunculus issue, but the reason the middle box is labeled H is because that's the homunculus that Atnian was defending. One reason for my preference is that Atnian wisely constructed his perception and action processing modules here and here. Let's do that. In a parallel fashion, using parallel principles. And I think ones that are very reflective of the, we'll call it debate between Wundt's structuralism and Gestalt's emphasis on objects. The notion here is that when we have some event that we're perceiving, relatively unanalyzed, we'll call it low-level sensory features, can be transmitted to this system, which is responsible for our awareness. But also relatively complicated and highly analyzed things can be too. So if you show somebody a red book, they might actually have the experience of red and the experience of a parallelogram of a certain size, but they might also have the experience of being shown a book. And on the output end, you can imagine pressing a button with your finger being a relatively simple response that you could make, and playing a piano piece as being a relatively complicated stored program that you could execute. And so we have a similar degree of, we'll call it hierarchy, in the input and the output end. So I mentioned from the input point of view, this middle system is responsible. In contemporary cognitive neuroscience, we're interested in which neural networks are responsible for the functions performed by the modules represented in our information flow diagrams. And importantly, how the neural networks perform these functions. So I've illustrated here Posner's 3 networks of attention that we'll be talking about later in the class. He has this notion of attention as being a rubric that encapsulates several notions. Alerting, or alertness, which refers to achieving and maintaining an alert state. Orienting, which entails selection of input, of information from sensory input. Possibly also selection of what you're thinking about next. And executive control, which involves planning, resolving conflict among responses, and many other, we'll call it functions of that H box in Atnian's model. Illustrated in these pictures are some of the brain regions that neuroimaging studies have suggested are primarily involved in each of these networks. They're not completely independent, they work together, but they're isolable for study, and one of the things we'll be doing in the class is seeing how that operates. If we follow Hebb's plan for understanding the organization of behavior to our study of attention, then we will want to connect our models of attention with the neural systems underlying. It's an exciting goal, but we're a long way from achieving a complete integration or understanding of how attentional processes are implemented in and by the brain. But we will be discussing a variety of methodologies that scientists have been using to advance this effort. So this has been a history of attention according to Klein. And I'm done talking to you, and I'm willing to take